Tonight, something happened that should terrify every single American who still believes in a free press. A major television network, one of the most powerful broadcast companies in the United States, made a decision in the shadows behind closed doors to silence a guest, not because he said something dangerous, not because he broke any rule, but because the most powerful political forces in this country picked up the phone and CBS answered. In the next 25 minutes, I am going to show you exactly how that silence was purchased, who paid for it, and why the man they tried to erase is now more dangerous to the political establishment than ever before. If you have never subscribed to this channel, do it right now, because what we cover here is precisely the content they do not want landing in your feed. Stay with me, because what comes next changes everything you think you know about who controls American television. Let me set the scene for you. It is a Tuesday evening in New York City. The Late Show with Stephen Colbert is exactly where it always is. Studio 1015 at the Ed Sullivan Theatre on Broadway. The audience is in their seats. The band is warmed up. The producers are running their final checks. Everything looks exactly the way it has looked on hundreds of nights before this one. Except tonight is not like any other night. Because sometime between the morning production meeting and the moment the cameras were supposed to roll, a phone rang, or an email arrived, or a lawyer walked into a room and closed the door behind them. And in that moment, in that quiet, invisible, undramatic moment, a decision was made that would expose something deeply broken at the heart of American broadcast television. James Telerico was scheduled to sit across from Stephen Colbert tonight, a Texas state representative, a man who has been making waves in Austin, on YouTube, and increasingly in the national conversation, a man who, by every legal and ethical standard that governs television broadcasting in this country, had every right to appear on that program. He never made it to that couch. And here is what makes this story different from every other story about corporate interference in media. It is not what CBS did, it is what CBS said afterward. Because CBS did not stay silent. CBS issued a written statement, and in that statement, CBS told the American public that the broadcast of James Telerico's interview could trigger the FCC equal time rule, and that this legal risk was the reason the interview was pulled from the broadcast. That explanation collapsed within hours. FCC Commissioner Ana Gomez issued a public statement making clear what any first-year communications law student already knows. The equal time rule does not apply to entertainment programming. It never has. Stephen Colbert's show is not a news broadcast. It is not a debate. It is not a political forum subject to federal equal time requirements. It is a late-night entertainment program, and entertainment programs have been explicitly exempt from that rule for decades. So the legal justification CBS offered to the American public was not just wrong, it was provably, demonstrably, embarrassingly wrong. And the lawyers who crafted that statement knew it was wrong when they wrote it. Which means the real reason James Telerico was pulled from that broadcast has nothing to do with the FCC, nothing to do with equal time, nothing to do with the law at all. And that is where this story gets dangerous. Because if the legal explanation is false, and it is, then something else drove this decision. Something CBS does not want to put in a written statement. Something that sits at the intersection of corporate money, political fear, and a level of institutional cowardice that should alarm every person watching television in America tonight. Stay with me, because we are just getting started. Let me be very direct with you about something right now. What CBS did to James Telerico was not a legal decision. It was not a compliance decision. It was not even a programming decision. It was a financial decision. And once you understand the money behind it, everything else snaps into focus with brutal clarity. Here is what you need to know. The parent company that owns CBS agreed to pay Donald Trump $16 million to settle a lawsuit against 60 Minutes. $16 million. For a lawsuit that legal experts across the political spectrum agreed Donald Trump had virtually no chance of winning. The case had no legal foundation strong enough to survive serious courtroom scrutiny, and yet the company wrote the check anyway. Then look at ABC. The parent company Disney agreed to pay Donald Trump $15 million to settle a lawsuit against ABC News. Another lawsuit, another settlement, Another check written to a man whose legal claims did not merit the payout. That is $31 million handed directly to the most powerful political figure in the country by two of America's three legacy broadcast networks. $31 million paid not because the law demanded it, not because a judge ordered it, but because the lawyers and executives at the top of those companies decided that paying was easier than fighting. Stephen Colbert called it exactly what it is, a big fat bribe. And here is the critical point that most coverage of this story has missed entirely. When a corporation pays a settlement, it does not legally owe. It is not buying peace. It is buying access. It is buying goodwill. It is buying the ability to operate without friction inside a political environment controlled by the person receiving that payment. That is not a legal transaction. That is a protection arrangement. And protection arrangements come with expectations. One of those expectations, it now appears, is that you do not put guests on your programs who represent a political threat to the man who cashed your check. James Telerico is running for the United States Senate in Texas. He is young, he is sharp, he is articulate, and according to people who have watched him very carefully, including a former president of the United States, he is genuinely dangerous to the political status quo in a state that the current administration cannot afford to lose. So when the lawyers at CBS intervened to pull his interview, they were not protecting the network from an FCC violation. They were protecting a relationship. They were honouring an unspoken arrangement made the moment that $16 million check cleared. And not one of those lawyers resigned. Not one person in that building stood up and said, "This is wrong and I will not be part of it." We have watched lawyers resign from the Department of Justice on principle. We have watched federal employees walk away from careers over matters of conscience. But inside CBS, inside ABC, inside the corporate legal departments that facilitated these payments, silence, compliance, and now active participation in the suppression of a guest on a television program. That is not legal counsel. That is political enforcement wearing a suit and carrying a bar card. And the American public deserves to know the difference. So who exactly is James Telerico? Because if you have never heard his name before this week, that is not an accident. That is a feature of the system we just described. People who threaten concentrated power do not get introduced to the public on their own terms. They get introduced in moments of crisis, moments exactly like this one. James Telerico is a Texas state representative. He grew up in Texas. He went to the University of Texas. He then went to Harvard's Graduate School of Education. And then he went further, earning a second master's degree from the Austin Presbyterian Theological Seminary. That last credential is not a footnote, it is a weapon, and we will come back to exactly why in just a moment. But first, consider this. Barack Obama, a man who has sat across from world leaders, Nobel laureates, and the most compelling political minds of the last half-century, was asked about James Telerico on the final episode of Mark Maron's podcast. And Obama did not hesitate. He called him terrific. He called him a really talented young man. He said there is something grounded about him. Something that allows him to walk into a room full of people who disagree with everything he believes and have a genuine conversation rather than a performance. That is not a casual compliment. That is a signal from someone who understands political talent at the highest possible level. Now here is the question that actually matters. What makes James Telerico specifically threatening to the people who just spent $31 million purchasing goodwill from American broadcasters? It is not his resume. Impressive resumes are everywhere in politics. It is not his age. Youth alone does not move the needle. It is something far more specific and far more difficult to defend against. James Telerico has mastered the ability to dismantle his opponents using their own language, their own values, and their own stated beliefs. He does not attack from the outside. He walks through the front door, sits down, and asks the questions that expose the contradictions hiding at the center of the argument. He does this with the precision of a lawyer, the fluency of a theologian, and the calm of someone who has never once needed to raise his voice to make a room fall silent. That combination, legal logic wrapped inside the language of faith delivered without anger, is something the current political establishment has no reliable counter to. And they know it, which is exactly why they are trying to make sure you never see him on television. Now I want to show you exactly what they are afraid of, because it is one thing to tell you that James Telerico is sharp, that he is grounded, that Barack Obama called him terrific. It is another thing entirely to watch him work. And when you watch him work, the panic inside those CBS boardrooms stops being a mystery and starts being completely logical. Let us start with what became known as the Furries Act. A Republican colleague introduced legislation in the Texas state legislature based on the claim that students across Texas were identifying as cats and that public schools were providing litter boxes in classrooms to accommodate them. This was not a fringe conversation happening online. This was an actual bill being debated in an actual legislative chamber, with actual taxpayer time being spent on it. Governor Greg Abbott had publicly stated, and I am quoting directly here, that kids were going to school dressed as cats with litter boxes in their classrooms. James Telerico walked up to the microphone and asked one question: "Can you name a single school where this has been confirmed?" The answer was no. Not one school, not one documented case, not one verified instance anywhere in the state of Texas. And Telerico was already prepared for that answer, because he had already done the work. He informed the chamber that when the Dallas Morning News asked Governor Abbott the same question, Abbott could not name a single school either. PolitiFact rated the claim pants on fire. The entire legislative premise was built on a rumour that had been fully debunked before the bill was even written. But Telerico did not stop there. He connected the dots publicly and on the record. The litterbox story was not random. It was infrastructure. It was part of a coordinated effort to turn Texans against their own public schools, to paint those schools as dangerous, bizarre, and unworthy of public funding, so that private school voucher legislation could be pushed through with popular support. Call teachers groomers, call librarians predators. Say students are using litter boxes. Repeat it until enough people believe it. Then defund the schools those people no longer trust. That is the machine Telerico exposed. Not with outrage, not with a press conference. With a single question and a willingness to follow the answer wherever it led. Now move to the second moment, the 10 Commandments bill. A Republican colleague introduced legislation to mandate the posting of the 10 Commandments in every Texas public school classroom. Telerico stood up and said something that stopped the room. He said he was speaking as a fellow Christian, and he said the bill was not only unconstitutional and un-American, he said it was deeply unchristian. He called it idolatrous. He cited Matthew chapter 6 verse 5, where Jesus instructs his followers not to pray publicly for performance. He asked whether a religion that needs to force a poster onto a wall to prove its legitimacy is a religion worth belonging to. No shouting, no theatrics, just precision. That is what they pulled off the air. Now I want you to step back from the specific names and the specific dollars for just a moment, because what happened to James Telerico this week is not really about James Telerico, and it is not really about CBS. What happened this week is a demonstration of something that has been quietly assembling itself in the background of American media for years. A system, a mechanism, an architecture of control that does not need government censorship laws to function, because it has found something far more efficient. It has found corporate self-interest. Here is how the mechanism works. A powerful political figure files a lawsuit against a media company. The lawsuit may be legally weak. It may be entirely without merit. But litigation is expensive. Litigation is time-consuming. Litigation creates uncertainty in boardrooms and on earnings calls and in conversations with shareholders. And so the company makes a calculation. Not a legal calculation, a financial one. It is cheaper to pay than to fight. And so they pay. And the moment they pay, something shifts. Not in the courtroom, in the hallway. In the phone call between the network executive and the lawyer, in the unspoken understanding that the relationship must now be protected, that certain guests create friction, that certain conversations carry risk, that certain interviews are simply not worth the trouble. No order is issued, no memo is written, no policy is formally changed. It happens the way all institutional cowardice happens, gradually, quietly, and with complete deniability. But here is what the architects of that system did not anticipate. The internet does not have a legal department. When CBS pulled James Telerico from the broadcast, Stephen Colbert moved the interview to YouTube, and the audience did not shrink. It exploded. The video became the most watched Colbert interview of the entire year. It reached more than double the audience that a Taylor Swift appearance generated on the same program. The suppression became the promotion. The censorship became the algorithm. Every corporate lawyer who signed off on pulling that interview effectively produced the most powerful advertisement James Telerico has ever had. Which raises a question that nobody in those boardrooms appears to have asked before making their decision. In 2025, who actually controls the information? Because the answer is no longer the network. It is no longer the broadcast license. It is no longer the lawyer in the corner office who decides what airs at 11:30 on a Tuesday night. The answer, increasingly, is the audience itself. And that audience just watched a major American broadcaster flinch. They saw exactly what it looks like when a corporation prioritizes a political relationship over its own stated mission of informing the public. They will not forget what that looks like. So let us talk about what comes next. Because this is where the story stops being about one interview on one network on one Tuesday night and starts being about the country you are going to be living in 5 years from now. What CBS established this week is a precedent, and precedents in media are extraordinarily difficult to walk back once they are set. The precedent is this. A broadcaster can be pressured into removing a guest not through a court order, not through a regulatory ruling, not through any legitimate legal mechanism, but simply through the implied threat of friction with a politically connected adversary. No law was invoked, no formal complaint was filed, no judge signed anything. The pressure was applied invisibly, and the network responded visibly. And now every other broadcaster in America has watched that transaction happen in real time. Which means every other broadcaster in America now knows exactly what the price of resistance looks like, and exactly what the reward for compliance feels like. That is not a media story, that is a democracy story. Because the First Amendment was not designed to protect popular speech. Popular speech does not need protection. The First Amendment exists precisely for the moments when powerful people want to silence inconvenient voices. And what we witnessed this week was a private corporation doing the work of suppression so that no government fingerprints would ever appear on the outcome. That is the most sophisticated version of censorship, the kind that never has to call itself censorship at all. And James Telerico understood this immediately. He said on this very program that an attack on any one First Amendment right is an attack on all of them. He said it without raising his voice. He said it without pointing fingers at a single political party. He said it as a statement of constitutional fact that any American Democrat or Republican, progressive or conservative, should be able to recognize as true. The question is no longer whether this happened. The question is whether it will happen again, and to whom, and whether anyone with the power to stop it will find the courage to do so. So far, the answer to that last question has been silence. Let me bring this home for you tonight. Here is what we know with absolute certainty. CBS pulled a legally scheduled interview using a legal justification that was factually false. 2 major American broadcast networks have paid a combined $31 million to a sitting political figure in settlements that legal experts agree were never legally necessary. Not one lawyer inside either of those companies resigned on principle. And the man they tried to erase from your television screen is now reaching more Americans than he ever would have reached if they had simply let him speak. The system designed to silence James Telerico made him impossible to ignore. But here is the question I want to leave you with tonight. If this mechanism, this quiet, corporate, deniable architecture of suppression, if it worked even partially this week, what happens when it gets more sophisticated? What happens when the next target is someone with less momentum, less of a YouTube following, less of a Barack Obama endorsement behind them? What happens when the person they try to erase simply disappears? That is the version of this story that does not have a happy ending. Which is exactly why you cannot let this conversation end here. Share this video right now. Every share is a direct counter to everything we talked about tonight. Subscribe to this channel because when the next move happens, and it will happen, you need to be the first to know. We are watching this story every single hour. The moment anything breaks, you will hear it here first. Stay vigilant, stay informed, and we will see you back here very soon.